Continuing on our journey of describing the four types of molecules that comprise the body, the next one that we're going to be visiting are the fats or the lipids. So I'll just tell you right now the four types are the carbohydrates, which kind of have that root saccharide or SACCH that we described in the previous video, lipids or fats that we're describing in this video. The next video after this will be proteins, and the one after that will be nucleic acids. So let's take a look at our typical way that we denote a fat. So this is a very typical fat in our body called a triglyceride. Now, I should say lipids are going to be some of those non-polar structures. Remember non-polar? You don't tend to share a lot of electrons, I should say the electrons are shared so equally amongst all of the atoms in the molecule that there is no partial positivity or partial negativity. It's sort of all centered. So remember that I said that when you have nonpolar things, a lot of times you'll see lots of C's and H's, and that is in fact what you see here. Whenever you see a tail like this or a long string of C's and H's, this would be called a hydrocarbon, and this would be this would definitely be nonpolar or fatty. So lipids are insoluble in water, but they do dissolve readily in nonpolar solvents such as an oil or other nonpolar structures. What we're looking at in this picture are triglycerides. Triglycerides are neutral fats that are commonly known as fats when solid and oils when liquid. Now, what we see in this picture, I just want to take you through this a little bit. There's a glycerol, what you might call a glycerol head here. And you'll see that there's a little bit of oxygen here. There's some OH groups here. And then there's a fatty acid tail, which is purely hydrocarbons. Now, this does not usually exist as one, but it usually exists as three. Triglyceride, because glycerol tends to have three carbons in a row, and so each of the carbons gets their own little fatty acid tail. So this is a triglyceride, three glycerol heads, three fatty acid tails, and they can be of varying lengths. You can have different lengths. Here's a fatty acid tail where you've actually taken out all the C's and H's, but we know what all of these things are. Yes, so it's entirely nonpolar. It's something that runs through your body all the time. These are actually really helpful they're high in energy, they're high in calories. So we actually we crave fatty food, and we like to break these bonds here to release energy. So all these bonds have a lot of energy in them. So we actually really like to have fats. They're very useful for our body, which means that we do consume them and we do take them into our body. Sometimes when we have a high fat diet, some of those fats circulate in the blood usually in the form of triglycerides. So when we do a blood count, when we look at somebody's blood, oftentimes as part of that, we will look at the triglyceride number, because that gives us an idea of how many free-floating fats there are in this person's blood. And it gives you kind of an example of how healthy they are, I guess, or how fatty their diet is, I suppose. The next type of fat we're going to be looking at is called a phospholipid. Ooh, super important. So we're looking at a polar head. Take a look at this. There's a polar head and two fatty acid tails. Here's our hydrocarbon tails. These are actually usually of about the same length, but the non-polar fatty acid tails means that a portion of the molecule is going to be fatty and only comfortable with other fats, other non-polar things. And then a portion of the molecule is going to be polar and only comfortable with other polar things. So you can see that this is actually a pretty involved structure, and it's a very common structure in our body. This is how we kind of draw it out, and we might actually draw some of these. I would encourage you to just go ahead and draw it yourself. Just draw a big circle with two little fatty acids tails. A lot of times they kink a little bit. There's a reason for that, which we might get into when we talk about cell membranes. So speaking of which, here's a cell membrane. So what happens with the phospholipids is they line up together. All those fatty acid tails are attracted to each other, and they don't love being in the body. Like, they don't love being exposed to all those polar fluids in the body, all those water-filled fluids in the body. So what happens is they tend to kind of cling to each other. You'll notice that all of the nonpolar fatty acid tails are sort of accumulated with each other, and all of the polar heads are either sticking this away or this away, because over here there's fluids that are filled with water, polar, and over here there are fluids that are filled with water, also polar. If we're denoting a cell, the bottom of the picture here would be the inside of the cell, and the top here would be the outside of the cell, what we might call the extracellular fluid versus the intracellular fluid. So phospholipids are what we call diglycerides, and they have this phosphorus-containing group and two fatty acid chain tails. Oh, and two more terms I want to make sure that we cover in this picture would be the terms hydrophilic, water-loving. That would pertain to the head here, which is polar, loves to be around water, which is also polar. And then we have a non-polar tail, a hydrophobic tail, which is water-fearing or water-repelling, if you will. So the root philic means loving and phobic means fearing. Let's see. And yeah, you'll see, oh, by the way, look at this. There's a phosphate group, a P with the O's. Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you we'd be coming across those? All right, so there's the phospholipids. That's what I want to say about that. The last of the fats I want to cover, I'm kind of hesitant to cover this right now because it's not something we're really going to discuss until the second semester of the class. But I'll just mention it now for now. This would be a steroid hormone or a steroid. Steroids tend to be kind of flat molecules. They have these four interlocking hydrocarbon rings. Now, this is not the same as a molecule of sugar. These would actually be hydrocarbons that are nonpolar. So this would be a steroid hormone. It's going to have varying groups along here. This is based on cholesterol, which is this backbone here. So I don't know if this is completely an accurate statement, but most anyway, if not all, of the steroids that are in our body are based on cholesterol, this four-link carbohydrate ring. And this is cholesterol with this attached to it. And then derivations of cholesterol are going to be things like our testosterone, our estrogen, our progesterone, two other structures that we are not yet ready for, which are called glucocorticoids or cortisol, and mineralocorticoids or aldosterone. So we'll be talking about that in the second semester of the class. Just remember that this is also a fatty, non-polar structure in our body. It's actually not a completely comfortable fit for these hormones to be running around in our body. They are oily. They are oily or fatty structures. So the three types of lipids that are kind of the ones that we talk about the most would be triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. Triglycerides would be things that run around in our blood and give us energy. Phospholipids are very, very important. They basically comprise the cell membrane of all of the cells of our body. And steroids, which help us with certain cell-to-cell communication and signaling in our body.